It was a Thursday afternoon in late October 1994, and rain was coming down in sheets over the small town of Wexford, Virginia. The kind of rain that made the air smell of wet leaves and old wood, and turned the narrow streets into silver streams. Inside the red brick schoolhouse at the edge of town, the last bell had rung. Hallways echoed with the shuffle of sneakers and the slam of locker doors as students rushed to escape the weather. But in room 3B, the sound of chairs scraping the floor was missing. The lights were still on, casting a yellow glow over neat rows of desks, yet the teacher's chair stood empty. Miss Claire Hartley, 39 years old, known for her crisp blouses and warm laugh, had been in the building just minutes earlier. Her attendance sheet lay on her desk, the pen she used to mark it still uncapped, as if she had only stepped away for a moment. Outside, the rain drummed harder on the roof, a steady, relentless beat. Somewhere above that roofline was the school attic, a narrow, dusty space most people forgot existed. A few students lingering in the hallway swore they'd heard her footsteps going up the creaky attic stairs just before the bell rang. They assumed she was looking for something among the stacks of old boxes and outdated textbooks stored there. When the janitor locked up at 4:30, he noticed her car still parked in the lot, beads of rain sliding down its windshield. By evening, when the storm eased and the street lamps flickered on, her car was still there. The school was searched from basement to roof, but Miss Hartley was nowhere to be found. It would be 3 days before the police made any public statement, and years before anyone would speak of what was hidden above the ceiling of room 3B. Before she vanished, Claire Hartley's life had been woven tightly into the fabric of Wexford. She had been teaching at the elementary school for nearly 15 years, guiding generations of children through the rough waters of arithmetic and GR. With a patience that seemed bottomless, parents trusted her, children adored her. She remembered birthdays, noticed when a shy student cut their hair, and kept a jar of peppermints in her desk for anyone having a bad day. Her small brick cottage on Maple Street was a short walk from the school, its windows framed by lace curtains and flower boxes that overflowed with marigolds in the summer. She wasn't married. Friends said it wasn't that she had avoided love, but that life simply kept filling up with other things: late nights grading papers, volunteering at library, Sunday dinners with her aging parents. Her closest companion was a gray cat named Oliver, who often followed her to the porch when she left for work in the mornings. She lived in quiet rhythm, waking at 6, tea with milk, a walk to school rain or shine, and home again by dusk unless there was a meeting. In the weeks before her disappearance, her students noticed small changes, though they didn't think much of them at the time. She would linger at the end of the day, her hands dusty from the attic, her hair a little mussed, the smell of old paper clinging to her clothes. "Just sorting through history," she would say with a quick smile before shooing them toward the door. One afternoon, she mentioned to a fellow teacher that the attic held things the school had no right to forget. It was said in a half-joking tone, but the way her eyes drifted after she said it suggested a weight behind the words. The night before she vanished, she had stopped by the corner store for milk and bread. The cashier, a former student, recalled she seemed distracted, counting her change twice and leaving without her receipt. That was the last ordinary evening anyone could remember, a night when the rain was just a forecast, the attic was just a place to store old yearbooks. And Claire Hartley was simply a teacher preparing for another day. It was subtle at first, the way unease began to creep into Claire Hartley's life. A custodian named Frank Miller remembered seeing her pause at the bottom of the attic stairs one morning, holding a cardboard box against her hip, ring upward as if listening to something only she could hear. When he asked if she needed help, she startled, actually flinched, before shaking her head and climbing up alone. Her colleagues began to notice she was keeping the attic key in her cardigan pocket instead of on the shared hook in the staff lounge. "Just easier this way," she'd say, but her tone didn't invite further questions. A few afternoons, she skipped the usual teacher's lounge chatter and went directly upstairs, returning only when the last students had gone home. Sometimes, the hem of her skirt was dusted with fine gray powder, and once, a faint tear along her sleeve hinted she'd snagged it on something sharp. Students picked up on the change too. A fifth grader named Laura Jensen recalled that Mrs. Hartley had begun locking her classroom door during lunch breaks, something she had never done before. One rainy Thursday, Laura had knocked, hoping to borrow an eraser. She heard movement inside, the scrape of something heavy being dragged, but the door remained closed. "Busy, dear," came the muffled reply. The most unsettling account came from a part-time librarian, Alice Dempsey, who swore she saw Claire leaving the attic one evening with her arms full of what looked like photo albums. They were bound with twine, the covers so worn they appeared almost black. Alice remembered asking if she was organizing old class pictures. Claire's reply was a soft, almost nervous laugh followed by, "These aren't for the archives." By the time October arrived, there was an edge to her kindness, a distracted air, as if her mind was always half a flight of stairs above in that dim, dust-filled space under the roof. Those who noticed didn't speak up, not yet. Whatever had taken root in that attic had not fully shown itself, but it was growing, and she seemed unable or unwilling to stay away. October 27, 1994. The rain had begun just after lunch, steady and cold, streaking the tall windows of the school with rivulets that blurred the view of the playground. By the time the final bell rang at 3:15, the hallways were already thinning. Students pulled up their hoods and ran for the buses, their sneakers squeaking against the damp linoleum. Claire Hartley stayed behind in her classroom, her handbag still hanging from the back of her chair. At 3:22, a seventh grader named Mark Holloway saw her in the stairwell that led to the attic, a cardboard box in her arms. She smiled at him quickly, distantly, and continued upward. The sound of the steps was faint under the patter of rain on the roof, but he swore he heard her stop halfway, as if catching her breath or listening. By 3:40, the building was nearly empty. The janitor, Frank Miller, was in the boiler room fixing a leak, and the front office secretary had already left to pick up her children. In the long corridor outside room 3B, the fluorescent lights flickered once, then steadied. No one saw Claire return from the attic. At 4:05, Frank passed by the bottom of the attic stairs and noticed the door was closed but unlocked. He called up, his voice echoing into the darkness above, but there was no answer. Only the hollow creak of the building settling in the wind. He assumed she had already gone home. By 4:30, rainwater was pooling in the parking lot. Claire's blue sedan was still there, parked neatly in its usual space. The driver's seat was dry, the keys nowhere in sight. Her coat hung on the back of her classroom door, and the attendance sheet lay open on her desk with the morning's date scrawled at the top. That night the rain fell harder, and the attic remained dark. No one knew it then, but the moment she had walked up those stairs would be the last time anyone in Wexford saw Claire Hartley alive. The first hours after Claire's absence went almost unnoticed. It was Friday morning before the alarm truly sounded, when the school secretary, Mrs. Collins, called her home and got no answer. By noon, her neighbors confirmed they hadn't seen her since the previous day. That afternoon, police cars rolled into the parking lot, their tires hissing on the wet asphalt. Officers began a methodical sweep of the building, starting with her classroom, then moving to the attic. The attic was low-ceilinged and cluttered, with boxes stacked in uneven towers. A single bare bulb cast a weak glow, leaving the far corners swallowed in shadow. Dust hung in the air like fine smoke, disturbed by every step. Officers searched each box, flipping through yellowed yearbooks, stacks of lesson plans, and broken projectors that hadn't been used in years. There was no sign of Claire, no handbag, no keys, no footprints in the dust that looked fresh enough to belong to her. Outside, volunteers gathered in raincoats, holding umbrellas and clipboards. Parents of her students, retired teachers, even the mayor's wife joined the search. They combed the playground, the sports field, and the wooded lot behind the school where the ground was soft and uneven. A search dog was brought in from a nearby county. It sniffed through the building and out toward the parking lot, but the trail faded quickly as if it had been washed away by the storm. by Saturday the search widened. The police checked her home, finding the front door locked and Oliver the cat pacing by the kitchen window. Inside, dishes from Thursday's breakfast were still in the sink. The bed was made, the mail stacked neatly on the table. It looked as though she had intended to come back that night. Rumors began to drift through the town, whispers about a man in a dark coat seen near the school, about an argument overheard in the staff parking lot. The week before, none of it could be confirmed. The local paper ran her photo on the front page under the headline, "Beloved Teacher Missing." In those first days, there was still a fragile hope she would walk through the door, explain it all, and smile that quick, reassuring smile that mad. People believe everything would be fine, but with each passing hour that hope grew thinner. By the second week, the search for Claire Hartley began to lose its shape. The initial energy that had filled the town, the late nights, the coordinated maps, the constant hum of police radios, faded into a quieter, heavier of waiting. Leads that had once seemed promising fell apart under scrutiny. The man in the dark coat turned out to be a substitute bus driver. The supposed argument in the parking lot was nothing more than two teachers debating over field trip funds. Detectives brought in to assist from Richmond pored over every scrap of evidence. They revisited the attic, this time with stronger lights and cameras, measuring every corner. The dust was thick except for faint scuff marks near the far wall, marks that led nowhere and ended abruptly, as if erased. A fragment of cloth was found snagged on a nail, but it matched nothing Claire had been wearing that day. Her family, already strained by days without sleep, began to fray. Her mother stopped answering the phone, her father spoke in clipped sentences, and her younger brother Daniel openly accused the school of hiding mething. At one town meeting, he slammed his hand on the podium, demanding to know why the attic hadn't been locked off and guarded from the first night. His words were met with murmurs, but no one could offer him the answer he wanted. Theories swirled like autumn leaves in the wind. She had left voluntarily, she had met with foul play, she had uncovered something at the school and paid the price. Each theory had its believers, but none had proof. Even the search dog teams that returned for a second sweep came back with nothing. By the end of November, the official investigation began to scale back. Patrol cars still cruised past her home, but the daily searches stopped. The school returned to its normal routine, though students noticed the attic door was now padlocked, the key kept in the principal's office. For the people of Wexford, life moved on in a mechanical way. But in the empty space where Claire Hartley's presence used to be, a quiet unease took root. It was as if the whole town had exhaled and without realizing it had stopped breathing back in. Nearly 12 years passed before anything stirred the case again. The school had changed hands, its red brick walls brightened with new paint, the old playground replaced by safer equipment. Most of the staff who had known Claire Hartley were gone, retired, or moved on. The attic had been sealed for years, a forgotten corner of the building. But in the spring of 2006, the district approved a renovation project to install new wiring. A carpenter named Bill Harmon was assigned to clear a narrow crawlspace that ran along the attic's far wall. He was working alone late one afternoon, dust swirling in the beam of his flashlight. That was when his glove brushed against something cold and metallic, a small padlock, its surface mottled with rust. It was fixed to a hatch no bigger than a suitcase lid, its edges nearly invisible against the warped wood. Bill called down to the foreman, asking if there was a blueprint for the hatch, but no one had ever seen it marked on any diagram. The principal, a man named Robert Keene, climbed up to take a look. He admitted he'd never known the hatch existed. It wasn't connected to the main storage area, more like a sealed compartment tucked between the attic wall and the roofline. The padlock crumbled under the carpenter's bolt cutters, flaking into orange dust. A stale, paper-scented air seeped out as the hatch creaked open. Inside, wrapped in a sheet of burlap, were several heavy bundles stacked neatly, the edges of them just visible in the beam of light. They weren't boxes of supplies or equipment, they were bound volumes, thick, worn, their covers faded and frayed. Bill reached for one, his fingers leaving clean tracks on the dusty surface. The twine was tight, as if whoever had tied it never meant for it to be opened again. Neither man spoke for a long moment, listening to the faint groan of the building around them. The renovation halted that day, the space roped off until the police could arrive. No one said the words aloud, but both men were thinking the same thing. They might have just stumbled onto something the school and the town had spent over a decade trying to forget. By the time the 8th day had passed, the small town felt different to me, as if its streets had learned to whisper. I woke before sunrise, the air still damp with the night's coolness, and made my way down to the riverbank. The current moved lazily, carrying bits of autumn leaves along its surface, the kind that catch the light in tiny flashes when the sun finally climbs high enough. I hadn't planned to meet anyone, but I found Samuel sitting on the old bench near the footbridge, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold. He looked tired, the kind of tired that settles deep into a person. We didn't speak at first. A gull cried overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed. I noticed his shoulders tense at the sound, as though the whole world was an echo he couldn't quite bear. When he finally turned to me, there was something unreadable in his eyes, half an apology, half a warning. "They're saying the map wasn't just some old scrap," he murmured. "They think it's tied to that clearing up near Hollow Ridge. The one nobody goes to anymore." His voice was so low that I had to lean in to catch the words. I wanted to ask him how he knew, but the question stuck in my throat. Instead, I just nodded, my gaze drifting to the slow swirl of the river. The truth was, I'd been dreaming about that place for nights now, though I'd never been there in my life. In the dreams, it was always twilight. Always silent except for the wind through the birches. A barge passed upriver, its engine churning the water into small, restless waves. Samuel took a breath as if to say more, then stopped, pressing his lips together. I could see the way his fingers tightened around the cup, knuckles pale. There was something he wasn't telling me, something that lived in the space between his words. We sat there until the sun was high enough to turn the water silver. Then, without another word, he stood and walked away, leaving the cup on the bench. I picked it up, still faintly warm in the center, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt as though I was holding a piece of his fear. That night the wind shifted. It carried the scent of pine and something faintly metallic like rain on old iron. I found myself standing at my window, looking north toward the ridge. The sky was clear, but the darkness there felt heavier than anywhere else, as if it had a weight of its own. I knew, without knowing why, that before this was over I'd have to go there alone. I turned away from the window and tried to breathe evenly, but the image of the map lingered in my mind. Its faded lines, the faint smear of ink where someone's hand had trembled, and that single warning written in block letters, "Do not enter." It no longer felt like a warning, it felt like an invitation. The night had fallen heavy over the small coastal town, swallowing the last streaks of orange that had clung to the horizon. Claire sat in her car at the far end of the pier, the windshield fogging slightly from her own breath. She could still hear the ocean, steady and indifferent, but her thoughts were anything but calm. The folder on the passenger seat lay half open, its contents spilling onto the worn upholstery, photographs, receipts, a handwritten note in pen so fad she had to squint to read it. She picked up the note again, tracing the uneven letters with her fingertip. It had been left in her mailbox 2 days ago with no name, no return address, just a single sentence that had lodged itself into her mind like a spline. You don't know the whole story." At first she'd thought it was a cruel prank. But now, with the documents she'd pieced together from the old library records, the town archives, and her own quiet visits to people who still she realized it wasn't a joke. Something had been hidden, something deliberate. The sound of footsteps on the wooden planks pulled her from her thoughts. She stiffened, peering through the rain-speckled glass. A man approached slowly from the direction of the boathouse, his shoulders hunched against the wind. His coat was old, too thin for the cold, and his hair hung damp across his forehead. She knew she should leave, but she couldn't make herself start the engine. He stopped a few feet from her car and tapped on the window. She rolled it down halfway, just enough for his voice to reach her without letting the cold rush in. "You've been asking questions," he said, not accusing but stating it as if it were an irrefutable fact. "I want the truth," she replied, her voice lower than she'd intended. "All of it." For a moment he said nothing. His gaze flicked toward the folder in her passenger seat, then back to her face. "The truth," he murmured, "isn't going to make you feel better. And once you hear it, you can't put it back." The wind carried the scent of salt and something faintly metallic. She felt the dampness in the air press against her skin. "Tell me anyway," she said. He stepped closer, his voice barely more than a whisper now. "It wasn't an accident, none of it was, and the person you've been looking for, they were never meant to come back." Claire felt the blood drain from her face. She didn't even notice her fingers tightening around the steering wheel until the leather creaked under her grip. "Who?" she asked, though her voice was so thin she barely recognized it as her own. The man took a slow breath, his eyes fixed on the dark water beyond them. "Meet me here tomorrow just before sunrise," he said. "I'll bring you proof." "But after that," he hesitated, his jaw tightening. "After that, you won't be able to leave this alone. And that's when it will start following you too." He turned and walked away before she could say another word, his figure swallowed by the mist rolling in from the sea. Claire sat motionless for a long time, the cold air creeping into the car through the narrow gap in the window. The ocean kept moving, steady and endless, but she knew nothing would feel steady again after tonight. The days after that final conversation felt strangely quiet. I kept expecting my phone to buzz, half hoping it would be his name lighting up the screen, half fearing it, but it didn't. The stillness left me more room than I wanted to think. I replayed our last moments, the way his eyes softened, the way neither of us really knew how to say goodbye without making it permanent. I started taking longer walks, mostly in the late afternoons when the air was cooler and the streets were lined with that golden light you only get in. Early autumn, sometimes, I'd pass by the little cafe where we had first run into each other. The bell over the door would still ring the same way when someone walked in. Once I even caught myself pausing outside, listening, wondering if he might be there by chance. He wasn't, but something had shifted. The ache I carried had a different shape now. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was more like a dull warmth, a reminder of something real that had touched my life even if it didn't stay. I found myself smiling at small things, steam curling from a coffee cup, the way a stranger held the door for me, the sound of children's laughter drifting from a nearby park. It was as if those moments were telling me that life still had its own quiet way of mending you. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I stopped at the waterfront. The water was calm, reflecting streaks of pink and orange. I leaned against the railing and let the breeze lift the edges of my hair. I thought about him, not with longing but with a kind of gentle gratitude. He had reminded me that love could still find its way into my life, even after years of thinking it was too late. And even though we had parted, the part of me he'd awakened wasn't going to fade. When I finally turned to leave, I felt lighter. Not because I had let go completely, but because I understood now that love doesn't always have to stay to leave something behind. Sometimes it just passes through, quietly changing the way you see the world, and that's enough. Whatever the truth was, the attic had swallowed it long before I climbed those narrow stairs. The dust, the silence, and the forgotten albums felt like pieces of a story that no one wanted to remember, or maybe no one dared to. As I left that day, I knew the house would keep its secrets, but the images burned into my mind wouldn't fade so easily. Maybe somewhere someone still knows who those faces belonged to, and why they were hidden away. If you've ever seen something like this, if you've stumbled across a fragment of a past meant to be erased, share it in the comments. Your story might be the missing piece to someone else's puzzle. And if you want more untold mysteries brought into the light, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications, because the next story might just be closer than you think.